Today's reading comes from the lectionary, and it's one of the classic readings for Lent. It arrives at a time when many of us are thinking about death more than usual, and it may be that we didn't really want to think about death this Sunday morning. However, this reading actually has some real wisdom embedded in it, if we can just unpack it. So that's what I'd like to do this morning. The story, of course, is famous. Lazarus, one of Jesus' friends, has died, and Jesus decides to raise him from the grave. The tale is presented as a form of theological theater. Jesus finds out that Lazarus is sick, and he deliberately waits for Lazarus to be so sick that he dies before he goes to visit Mary and Martha, because he wants to make a point. He wants to show who he really is, the Lord of life, who can conquer even death. Christ's most loyal followers, like Mary and Martha, have heard Jesus talk about the idea of this general resurrection, this time in the future when all will be raised from the dead in their bodily form. But Jesus wants to show what it's like right now. And the resurrection that we see in the Lazarus story is different from the resurrection that we'll be hearing about when we celebrate on Easter Sunday. If you recall those stories, Jesus appears to his followers like doubting Thomas, and his body is as though it's as fresh as the day he died. His wounds are still fresh. He invites Thomas to poke his fingers into his side. His body doesn't seem to have decayed in any way. He's just risen as though death had never had any influence on him. But with Lazarus, it's different. Lazarus, we're told, has been in the tomb for 4 days, long enough to start to stink. This is a decomposing body, the kind of body we all expect to have when we die, one which is going to start to rot. And this is the body that Jesus raises. This is an example not of how Jesus will be resurrected, but how all of us will be resurrected. And that poses a problem for us, of course, because I suspect that most of us don't really believe in the general resurrection. That idea that one day at the end of time, all of us will be pulled out of our graves or our bodies will be reconstituted and face Jesus once again, that idea has gone out of style. However, studies show that the idea of the afterlife is still really popular. In both the United States and Canada, the belief in the afterlife has remained pretty steady for the last 50 or 60 years. It usually hovers around 73% or so. The Americans believe in it a little bit more than we do. They believe in it about 73%, and Canadians are down in the 60s. Although, ironically, in Canada, the people who believe in the resurrection the most are millennials. Millennials believe that, not the resurrection, rather, the afterlife. Millennials believe in life after death at around 70% in Canada, which is the highest number among all the age groups. But the one thing that very few people believe is that we will be living in a body in the afterlife. Most of us, I think, would like to believe that, might look like ourselves in heaven as we're greeting our friends and our professors and anybody else that we'd ever wanted to see again. And maybe the body that we have will be the hottest body we ever had. Why not have the best body we ever had? But very few of us believe that we're going to have this physical body, a body with flesh and blood and breath. That idea is only believed in by around 36% of the population. And that was in a study from 2006, so it's probably dropped even further. The idea of a flesh and blood resurrection is now quite uncommon. It's not what most Christians believe. The Christian idea of being raised body and soul for the afterlife has been replaced by a general belief in the survival of the mind in spiritual form. And most of us hope that when we die, it'll be our mind, our consciousness that will be eternal. And that reflects a shift in how we think about ourselves. Not just in the afterlife, but how we think of ourselves right now. Most of us, I think, believe that the essence of who we are is our mind. It's our consciousness. We consider ourselves to be like drivers in a car, and the car is our body that just carries our consciousness. In science fiction, people often fantasize about transferring their consciousness into a robot body so they can continue to be themselves, because the essence of who we are in our modern conception of self is just our mind. That sense of consciousness, that awareness that we have of being around. Our body is just along for the ride. And when we die, we expect that, like a driver, we will just get out of the car and leave our bodies behind, which can disintegrate, and it doesn't matter what happens to them. This idea of our minds being the essential part of who we are is not actually a Christian idea. It's a Greek idea. And we know this because in the early days, the Christians and the Romans and the Greeks used to have all sorts of arguments with each other about the afterlife. And the Greeks, following Plato, said that the eternal part of a human being is our spirit, our mind, our awareness. And that's what will last even after our body dies. Whereas Christians said, no, that's not true. They pointed to the Lazarus story, and of course they pointed to Jesus' story. And they said that we will be resurrected, body and soul. And they duked this out in letters and essays with each other among intellectuals and on the streets, but they also lived it. Back in the first few centuries, Christians decided that if their bodies mattered so much, they were going to need them in the afterlife. So they decided to bury them in tombs, underground tombs. And there are many of these which have been preserved in Rome. The Greeks and the Romans didn't think their bodies mattered, so they burned their bodies. They just cremated them and just got rid of them. Whereas the Christians wanted to hang on to them, and in these tombs, they put up pictures of people rising from the dead in this kind of position. This is called Maran's position. And these tombs are full of pictures of people arising in their full bodies as full humans at the end of time. For a long time, once Christians prevailed over Roman and Greek culture, the Christian idea was the only idea that people had. People expected to be resurrected in their bodies, and that could take strange forms. There were cases where someone would be found guilty of a crime after they had died, and they would dig up their body and they would give it the punishment it would have deserved as a living person, because you are your body in the Christian view. A strange way of looking at things, but it shows how seriously they took this idea of your identity being embedded in your body. But there's been a shift, hasn't there? We don't think of ourselves that way anymore. We think of ourselves as a mind. Most of us are followers of René Descartes, whether we know it or not. He was the 17th century philosopher who said, "I think, therefore I am." And he considered the body to just be a machine that our consciousness resides within. Without even knowing much about the ancient Greeks, somehow their idea of who we are has prevailed. But today's reading, the reading that tells us about Lazarus coming out of the grave, suggests that the Greeks are wrong, at least from the Christian point of view, that we're not just minds, but we're body and soul together. And we chafe at this. That doesn't sound right to us. Most of us don't feel like we should ever be generally resurrected. We want heaven to start right away just with our minds. But why should what happens in the afterlife be up to us? We're so used to thinking about reality from a consumer point of view, where we get to go shopping for whatever we want and just to find the right size. And so we think that we can imagine what the afterlife would be like based on what we would like it to be like. But chances are, if there is an afterlife, it has its own rules and regulations. And it's going to roll out the way it wants to. Its system will prevail, and we just have to fit into it, whether we like it or not. That contrast between what we want and what reality is going to give us could not be more stark than the period we're living through right now with this pandemic. One small invisible virus, just a rogue piece of genetic code, 1/500th the size of the width of a human hair, this tiny, tiny invader has turned our civilization completely upside down. In Spain, in Italy, in Iran, coffins are literally piling up in churches. The crematoriums can't take any more. There's nowhere to put the dead. thousands upon thousands of people who were just leading a normal life when this virus came about are now dead. How could that Spanish grandmother know that when the kids came to visit, the kisses they gave on both cheeks would be the fatal mistake, would be what sends her to her grave? And how could an Italian man who decided to just hug a friend closely, how could he ever have known that that would be the thing that would send him to his grave prematurely? How could normal life led by people like us, with normal gestures of greeting, a kiss, a hug, a handshake, how could these simple gestures have become so deadly? We reel from the injustice of it all. We were just leading the lives that we deserve. How could we know that this was dangerous? How could sharing affection with friends and family suddenly be the worst thing that we could do? How could we know that if we just locked down a week earlier, people would have survived? We're feeling shock, anger, fear, and disbelief. How can our entire way of life be hijacked by something so tiny, so seemingly insignificant? And how does this COVID-19 virus have the right to do so much damage? Our sense of what we want and what reality wants have smashed into each other, and we're the ones lying on the floor. So what do we do? Where do we look for hope in this? Well, when Christians first started telling people that we can expect a general resurrection, they were introducing a new idea of what it means to be human. Not just how things will go in the afterlife, but what it means to be human right now in this life. The Christians pointed to the Lazarus story and Christ's resurrection, and they said, when God looks at a human being, he doesn't just see a soul. God sees a body and soul fused into one, and that's what a human being is. And since our current crisis is a crisis of bodies, this idea of theirs deserves a second look. When the early Christians argued with the Greeks about this idea of the general resurrection and about what it means to be human, the Christians said, human beings are bodies and souls fused together like dancers. Another metaphor they used was that God created us like a work of art. The whole package, not just our minds, but our bodies too. And God, being a master craftsperson, once God made a human being, God wouldn't want it to be thrown away by death or anything else. And as a result, when the resurrection came, God wanted to have both parts, soul and body, present to live eternally. Because there was this new value on the whole human being, not just the mind. And it was very clear to the Christians that what we think and feel is never separated from what goes on in our bodies. And we all know this intuitively, right? If you're hungry, you can get hangry, right? Your capacity for being a cool, intellectual, rational person is undermined by something as simple as hunger. Your body has a need and your mind reacts. The same thing is true when we get tired. When we get tired, we find that our thoughts get sluggish, we can't make decisions very well, we don't remember things. Young parents, for anyone who's ever been a young parent, you know this is baby brain, right? The toll of sleep deprivation becomes so high on us that we forget why we went up the stairs. We can't remember what we just said. Short-term memory goes out the window. And of course, we all know about the ravages of Alzheimer's on our brains, that who we are, what we can think, is decisively shaped by what's happening in our body physically. Modern science completely agrees with the early Christian conception of the self. Science has found that our thoughts and emotions are basically determined by chemical reactions in our brain, which are in turn influenced by chemical reactions which go on through our entire body. We know that when people have strokes or a blood vessel pops in one side of the brain, it doesn't just impede them from speaking, it also changes the kinds of thoughts that we have. If you have a stroke in your right hemisphere, your left hemisphere ends up taking over most of the work, and it sees the world differently than your right hemisphere does. People who have had right hemisphere strokes and are reliant on their left become more egocentric. They tend to talk on and on and on, and they have a hard time reading body language. That's because those abilities are over here, not in the left hemisphere that they're now relying on. Similarly, we know that chemical changes can result in depression. And if you add drugs to the body like cannabinoids and other opiates, you can completely change your feeling and the way you see the world. Our thoughts and our body are intimately intertwined. Science has proven this with more examples than we can count. And this is entirely consistent with the early Christian conception of human beings. René Descartes was wrong when he said that we are our minds only and our bodies are just like a vehicle that we ride around in. Instead, our minds, our sense of self is deeply intertwined with our body. It makes little sense to imagine a mind separated from its body, since so much of our identity, our emotions and our thoughts are influenced by what happens in our bodies. And so the Lazarus story is a statement about what it means to be human. Are you a lucky person? Are you a happy-go-lucky person? Are you a melancholy person? Well, the answer for why that is the case is in your entire body, the way your chemistry works. And so when Christians imagined life after death, it had to include the resurrection of our bodies too, because our body is such a critical part of who we are and how we think and feel. And that's why Lazarus is raised in his body, and not just as a ghost or a transparent spirit or wraith. Our reality as human beings lies in being embodied. We are body and soul, not just body. The early Christians inspired a new appreciation for the body, and this is a time to take that to heart. Science has shown us that our immune systems work best if we're well rested, if we get moderate exercise, preferably every day, and if we eat well. This is a time when our minds need to help our bodies be in the best shape that they can be. Because our bodies need help in avoiding this virus, and if it arrives, in fighting it off long enough so that we can get the help that we need in the hospital if we need it. And if not, it would be good to get healthy as quickly as possible so we can be helpful to others. And to achieve that, our bodies and minds are going to have to work together. Now that many of us are under house arrest, of course, it's very tempting to just binge watch Netflix until the late hours of the night, to eat as much comfort food as possible. People are starting to talk about putting on the COVID-19, the COVID-19 pounds, because we're all stuck at home. But we have to be wise about this. A few extra pounds will be okay, but even though you may be stuck in your home, try to take time to get some exercise in your home. Get your steps in. Pull out those old Jane Fonda videos if you've got them, or just go to YouTube. There are lots and lots of exercise videos online that you can do at home. This is a time to stay healthy, to really help your body. We are not just our minds, and we are our bodies as well, and they're going to need our help. None of this will help you from getting infected, but it could help you clear the virus more easily should it come. Or it may buy you time, so if you need a ventilator, it'll be ready for you. There's nothing in the Bible about flattening the curve, but I think it's clear that it's the compassionate thing to do. Christ raised Lazarus to show that death is not final. It is subject to the one who calls himself the life, the truth, and the way. We may not be certain about the idea that we'll be resurrected, body and soul, in the end time. But one thing that we can be certain of is that now more than ever our bodies need our help and the wise guidance from our minds, that we're like dancers in this together in this human life. And it's time now more than ever that we dance in step. So be compassionate to your body, for you and your body are in this together, as you have always been. and know that when God looks on you, God sees a work of art, wrinkles, pounds, and all. Let us embrace our full humanity, knowing that we are loved in this life and into the next. Amen.